An obese 16-year-old was sold to a mountain man as punishment by her father. That's what the town said as the wagon vanished into the hills. They figured she was gone for good, cast out, discarded like a broken tool. But up in those mountains, behind a locked door and a fire that never dies, something waits. The man who took her isn't what he seems, and the girl they all gave up on. She's about to uncover a truth no one's ready for. When the past comes knocking and the valley turns cold, one question remains. Who was saved that day, and who was judged too soon? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The spring sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Whetstone as William Turner's angry voice cut through the morning air. His large hand gripped Emily's arm tight enough to leave marks as he dragged her past the hitching posts and water troughs toward the general store. "Time's up," he bellowed, yanking her up the wooden steps. "I've had enough of this dead weight." Emily stumbled, her cheeks burning with shame as curious townsfolk began to gather. Her plain brown dress was wrinkled from her father's rough handling, and wisps of dark hair had come loose from her neat braid. She kept her eyes fixed on the weathered boards beneath her feet, trying to make herself as small as possible despite her size. "Hear me now," William announced to the growing crowd. "I'm offering up this girl my own flesh and blood in exchange for a good hunting rifle and 3 sacks of flour." His voice dripped with disgust. "She's strong enough for work if anyone's willing to break her of her useless ways. Too soft for ranch life, too stubborn to change." The morning silence stretched painful and thick. Emily could hear her own rapid breathing, feel the curious and pitying stares of the townspeople she'd known all her life. The general store owner's bell tinkled as someone stepped out onto the porch, but she didn't dare look up. "She's 16 now, and I'm done trying to toughen her up." William continued, giving her arm another shake. "Time she learned what real suffering is." Bootsteps creaked on the wooden boards. A shadow fell across Emily's downturned face. "I'll make that trade." The voice was quiet, but firm like mountain granite. Emily's head jerked up despite herself. She recognized the tall figure of Jack Davis, the reclusive mountain man who came to town only a few times each year for supplies. His beard was shot through with gray, his clothes sturdy but worn. Deep lines were etched around his eyes, which held neither cruelty nor kindness as they assessed her. "Well, now," William said, a note of surprise in his tone. "Didn't expect you'd be interested, Davis." "You sure about this?" I said. "I'll make the trade." Davis's voice remained level. "My rifle's in good condition. I'll add the flour, too." He gestured to his wagon at the bottom of the steps. William's grip finally loosened. "Done then." He gave Emily a small push toward Davis. "She's your problem now." The transaction was completed with brutal efficiency. Emily stood frozen as Davis retrieved the rifle and ammunition, then loaded 3 heavy sacks of flour from his wagon onto the store's porch. Her father examined the weapon with more care than he'd ever shown her, testing the action and sighting down the barrel. "Fair trade," he declared finally. Then he spat in the dust near Emily's feet. "You'll learn real suffering up there in those mountains, girl. Might finally make something of you." Without another word or backward glance, he strode away, rifle cradled in his arms. Emily watched him go, her whole body trembling despite the warm spring air. The crowd began to disperse, though she could hear their whispers trailing behind them. "Come on, then," Davis said quietly. He didn't touch her, just gestured toward his wagon. "Long ride ahead." Emily followed him down the steps on shaky legs. The wagon was loaded with supplies, tools, feed sacks, barrels of kerosene. Davis helped her up onto the wooden seat, then reached into a bag and pulled out a rough wool blanket and half a loaf of bread. "Might get cold," he said, offering both items. "Eat if you're hungry." She took them automatically, clutching them to her chest like shields. The bread smelled fresh, but her stomach was tied in too many knots to even think about eating. Davis climbed up beside her and took up the reins. With a gentle click of his tongue, the horses started forward. The wagon wheels rumbled over the rutted street as they left Whetstone behind. Emily kept her eyes fixed on the trail ahead, not daring to look back at the only home she'd ever known. The blanket lay unused in her lap despite the cooling afternoon air. Her mind whirled with questions she was too frightened to voice. The mountains loomed before them, their snow-capped peaks stark against the spring sky. Somewhere up there lay whatever fate Davis had in store for her. Her father's final words echoed in her head, real suffering. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and prayed silently for strength to face whatever lay ahead. The mountain trails grew steeper as afternoon faded into evening. Emily's fingers had gone numb despite the blanket, and her body ached from hours of sitting on the hard wagon seat. The horses' breath came out in white puffs as Jack guided them carefully around switchbacks and over rocky ground. Just as the sun dipped behind the peaks, Jack pulled the wagon into a small clearing sheltered by towering pines. "We'll rest here tonight," he said, setting the brake. He climbed down and began unhitching the horses with practiced movements. Emily stayed perched on the seat, watching as he laid out feed for the animals and gathered wood for a fire. The spring night was settling in cold and fast. When the flames caught and began to crackle, Jack looked up at her. "Best come down by the warmth," he said. "No sense freezing up there." Her stiff muscles protested as she climbed carefully down. She kept the blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders and settled onto a fallen log well back from both the fire and Jack. He didn't seem to mind her caution, just went about his tasks with quiet efficiency. Soon a pot of beans was heating over the flames, and the rich smell of coffee filled the clearing. Without a word, Jack filled a tin plate and cup, setting them on the log beside Emily, before retreating to his own spot across the fire. While she ate small, careful bites of the warm beans, he gathered pine boughs and lashed them together into a simple lean-to shelter several yards from the fire. He laid out a bedroll inside it, then returned to his place by the flames. For privacy, he explained, seeing her questioning look. "You'll sleep there. I'll keep to this side of the fire." Emily nodded, slightly relief, mixing with her lingering fear. At least he wasn't expecting her to share his space. They were on the trail again at first light, winding higher into the mountains. The wagon creaked and swayed as Jack guided it through narrow passes. By mid-morning, they came around a bend, and Emily saw their destination, a weathered cabin tucked against a hillside with a clear stream running nearby. A chicken coop and small goat pen stood to one side, and a vegetable garden lay dormant behind a rough fence. Jack helped her down from the wagon, then led her to the cabin door. "This is home," he said, simply pushing it open. Inside, morning light filtered through two small windows, illuminating a tidy but sparse room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a table and chairs nearby. Shelves held cooking implements and supplies. A ladder led to a loft above. "Kitchen's here," Jack said, gesturing around the main room. "Loft up there will be your sleeping space. My room's through that door." He pointed to the cabin's only interior door. "You won't be expected to cook or clean for me. Won't be expected to serve me in any way." Emily's eyes widened slightly at this. She'd assumed she'd been bought as a servant at best. Jack's weathered face held no expression, but his voice was firm. "This place is quiet," he said. "It's peace, you need not penance." That night, Emily lay in the loft on a surprisingly comfortable straw-tick mattress, warm beneath several quilts. The fire below crackled softly. Through the small window, she could see stars scattered across the mountain sky like diamonds on black velvet. Tears came then silent and hot on her cheeks. She wasn't sure if she was crying from grief over her father's final rejection or relief at finding herself somewhere unexpectedly safe. Perhaps it was both. She fell asleep to the gentle sound of the stream outside. When she woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window, and the cabin was filled with the smell of cornbread and bacon. Emily lay still for a long moment, letting herself fully register that she was warm, comfortable, and most surprisingly of all, still safe. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at the mountain cabin. Each morning Emily rose with the sun pulled on her worn boots and made her way to the goat pen. The animals quickly grew to know her, pressing their soft heads against the fence when they heard her approach. She found comfort in their eager bleats and the warm weight of their bodies as she milked them. The chicken coop became another morning constant. Emily discovered she enjoyed gathering eggs, reaching carefully under warm feathered bodies to collect the smooth brown treasures. Sometimes she would pause to watch the hens scratch and peck in their yard, their movements purposeful and unhurried. In the garden, spring was awakening the soil. Jack showed her how to turn the earth with a spade, breaking up the winter-hardened ground. Her muscles ached at first, but grew stronger with each passing day. When she successfully planted her first row of peas, pressing each seed into the dark soil with careful fingers, she caught Jack nodding approvingly from across the yard. The mountain air felt different from the cattle town below. Up here, the breeze carried the scent of pine and wild sage. Even the sunlight seemed cleaner, filtering through the trees in gentle rays. Emily found herself breathing deeper, her shoulders gradually releasing their tight hold. One afternoon, while sweeping the wooden floor of her loft, Emily's broom caught on something under an old wool blanket tucked against the wall. Kneeling down, she pulled back the blanket to reveal a trunk made of dark wood, its brass fittings dulled with age. A heavy lock held the lid firmly closed. Her fingers traced the intricate carvings on the lid, flowers and vines woven together in a beautiful pattern. Something about the trunk made her heart beat faster with curiosity, but she carefully replaced the blanket. This was Jack's home, and she had no right to pry. That evening, as they sat in their usual quiet spots by the fire, Emily gathered her courage. "Mr. Davis," she said softly, "might I ask about your past, about how you came to live up here alone?" Jack's face went still like a pond freezing over. "Some things are best left buried, girl," he said, his voice clipped and final. He stood abruptly and walked outside, leaving Emily alone by the fire. She didn't ask again, but questions lingered in her mind like smoke. Why would a man choose such solitude? What secrets did that locked trunk hold? Later that week, the afternoon quiet was broken by the sound of hoofbeats. A woman rode into the yard on a sturdy brown mare, her silver-streaked hair bound back in a practical braid. She carried saddlebags that clinked with glass jars. "Anna Thompson," Jack said, emerging from his workshop, "didn't expect you for another week." "Thought I'd bring these dried mint and preserves early," the woman replied, dismounting with practiced ease. Her sharp eyes found Emily standing uncertainly by the cabin door. And who might this be? Jack drew Anna Thompson aside, and they spoke in low voices for several minutes. Emily couldn't hear their words, but she saw the woman's expression shift from concern to understanding. After their discussion, Anna Thompson approached Emily with a warm smile. "Come help me unpack these jars, child," she said, leading her to the mare's saddlebags. As they worked, Anna Thompson spoke quietly. "I've known Jack Davis for 15 years. He's a good man, though life's dealt him some hard blows. You're safe as a spring daisy here, make no mistake about that." Emily nodded, something tight in her chest, loosening at the woman's words. That night, after Jack had retired to his room, Emily sat cross-legged in her loft. She pulled out the small notebook and pencil she'd brought from town, one of the few possessions she'd managed to keep. By lantern light, she began to sketch the wildflower she'd seen growing along the stream that morning. Her fingers moved surely across the paper, capturing the delicate petals and sturdy stems. Drawing had always been her secret comfort, something her father had dismissed as useless foolishness. But here, in the quiet loft, with only the crickets and the distant cry of a nighthawk for company, she felt free to create. The flowers emerged on the page, as real as the mysteries that surrounded her new home. The spring storm rolled in without warning, dark clouds gathering over the mountains like heavy wool blankets. Thunder cracked overhead as rain pelted the cabin's roof, forcing Emily and Jack to remain indoors. The close quarters might have felt awkward, but Emily found herself settling into a peaceful routine even within the confined space. On the first morning of their confinement, Emily noticed a pile of Jack's shirts needed mending. She picked up a worn blue work shirt, finding comfort in the familiar task of threading a needle. Her father had never allowed her to fix his clothes, claiming her stitches weren't neat enough, but Jack nodded gratefully when she offered. As she worked the steady drum of rain against the windows, keeping time with her needle, Jack did something unexpected. He reached for a leather-bound Bible that sat dusty on a shelf, its pages yellow with age. Opening it carefully, as if handling something both precious and dangerous, he began to read aloud. His voice was rough, hesitant, lacking the passionate delivery one might expect from Scripture. Used to know these words better, he muttered almost to himself before continuing with the Psalms. Emily listened as she sewed, noting how his fingers trembled slightly when turning the pages. The second day of the storm brought an unexpected visitor. While Emily was stirring a pot of beans, a loud clatter at the door made her jump. One of the young goats had escaped its shelter and pushed its way into the cabin, tracking mud across the floor. The animal stood there dripping and bleeding, looking entirely pleased with itself. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Emily laughed. The sound surprised her, clear and genuine, echoing off the wooden walls. Even Jack's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile as they worked together to escort the determined creature back outside. When the storm finally cleared, leaving puddles and fresh green shoots in its wake, Jack began teaching Emily practical skills she'd never learned at her father's ranch. He showed her how to position the axe just right to split kindling his calloused hands, adjusting her grip on the handle. Let the weight of the axe do the work, he instructed, watching as she successfully split a piece of pine. That's right, no need to force it. They developed a rhythm with the water carrying too. Every morning and evening, they'd make their way to the creek, each carrying 2 buckets. Emily learned to walk smoothly, despite the weight finding balance in the gentle sway of the water. The creek sang its own kind of music, bubbling over rocks, whispering through reeds. One clear afternoon, Jack found Emily sitting on a sun-warmed rock near the cabin, her notebook open on her lap. She'd been so absorbed in sketching a cluster of columbines that she hadn't heard him approach. Instead of turning away, as he usually did when he caught her at her private pursuits, he paused to look at her work. "You've got a good eye for detail," he said quietly, noting how she'd captured the delicate curl of each petal. "The way you've drawn the light hitting the flowers, that's truth on paper." Emily felt warmth spread through her chest at the unexpected praise. Later that day, Jack brought her several sticks of charcoal from his workshop, wrapped carefully in a scrap of cloth. "These might serve you better than that pencil," he offered. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Emily gathered her courage once more. The question had been building in her mind since she'd first arrived, growing stronger with each gentle interaction between them. "Mr. Davis," she began softly, "did you ever have children of your own?" The silence stretched long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking up from the fire, he spoke a single word. "Once." That night, Emily's dreams were filled with unfamiliar images. She saw a small church, its windows dark, except for one flickering candle. Inside, a child sat alone in a wooden pew, crying softly. The sound echoed in the empty space, mixing with the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls. She woke with tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't say why. Looking down from her loft, she could see Jack's shape in his rocking chair by the dying fire. He wasn't sleeping, just staring into the embers, his shoulders bearing the weight of whatever memories her question had stirred. In that moment, Emily understood that trust, like the spring flowers outside, was something that grew slowly, nourished by patience and gentle care. 3 weeks passed like water flowing in the mountain stream, steady and clear. Each morning, Emily woke earlier, her muscles no longer protesting the daily chores. She found herself walking further from the cabin each day, first just to gather kindling, then to explore the wildflower meadows that dotted the mountainside. Her legs grew stronger with each venture, and her breathing came easier on the uphill climbs. One warm afternoon, while checking the henhouse for eggs, a commotion caught her attention. Near the corner of the building, tangled in a mess of old baling twine, lay a red-tailed hawk. Its wing twisted at an awkward angle, and its fierce eyes watched her with a mixture of fear and defiance. Emily's heart squeezed at the sight. Moving slowly, she shrugged off her shawl and approached the injured bird. "Easy now," she whispered the way she'd heard Jack speak to spooked animals. The hawk made no sound as she carefully wrapped her shawl around its body, mindful of its sharp beak and talons. The bird weighed less than she expected as she carried it to the cabin's porch. "Mr. Davis," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need help." Jack emerged from his workshop, sawdust coating his sleeve. His eyes widened slightly at the hawk in Emily's arms, but he didn't hesitate. "Bring it to the table," he said, already moving to gather supplies. Together they worked to free the bird from the twine. Jack's hands were gentle as he showed Emily how to hold the hawk still while he examined the injured wing. "Not broken," he muttered, "just strained and scratched up some." They cleaned the wing with water and herbs, then bound it carefully with strips of clean cloth. The hawk remained surprisingly calm under their ministrations, as if sensing their intent to help. When they finished, Emily stroked one finger along the bird's sleek head. "You're like that bird," Jack said quietly, his voice rough with something that might have been emotion. "Still got flight in you." Over the next few days, Emily tended to the hawk, keeping it in a makeshift pen on the porch where it could see the sky. She brought it fresh water and bits of meat, watching as it grew stronger day by day. Sometimes she caught Jack observing her care of the bird with an expression she couldn't quite read. The afternoon Anna Thompson arrived for her regular visit, the hawk had just begun testing its wing. Emily was so excited to show the midwife their patient that she almost missed the worried look that passed between Anna and Jack. After checking the hawk's progress, Anna pulled Emily aside while Jack went to tend the goats. The older woman's usually cheerful face was creased with concern. "Your father's been talking in town," Anna said carefully, her hands busy with her herb basket, "spreading ugly rumors about why Jack's keeping you up here." She paused, meeting Emily's eyes. Shameful things that decent folks shouldn't repeat. Emily's stomach twisted into knots. She thought of Jack's unfailing respectfulness, his careful distance, the way he'd given her space to heal and grow. The idea that anyone could think otherwise made her feel sick. When Anna left, the cabin felt heavier with unspoken words. Jack barely touched his supper, and the silence stretched between them like a shadow. Finally, as the evening fire burned low, he spoke. "Reckon you ought to know something," he said, staring into the flames. "Long time ago, before I came to these mountains, I was a preacher down in Kansas." He paused, running a hand over his face. During the war, something terrible happened, something I couldn't. His voice trailed off, and he didn't continue. Emily waited, but no more words came. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars. Eventually, Jack stood and added another log to the flames, leaving them burning low for the night. He retreated to his room without another word, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts and the soft hooting of an owl outside. Through the window, she could see the hawk in its pen, its silhouette dark against the evening sky. Like her, it was healing, slowly gathering strength for whatever lay ahead. She wondered what secrets Jack carried, what burden made his shoulders slump when he thought no one was watching. But she knew, just as she knew the sun would rise tomorrow, that some hurts took time to heal, and some stories needed patience to unfold. 3 days after the hawk incident, Anna Thompson's wagon rattled up the mountain path again. This time she carried news of a different sort. As they sat on the porch drinking mint tea, she turned to Jack with a gentle smile. "John Black asked after you at the trading post," she said, watching Jack's face carefully. "The summer gathering starts tomorrow evening. He hopes you might come." Jack's shoulders tensed. He stared into his tin cup as if searching for answers in the steaming liquid. "Been a long time since I attended," he said quietly. "All the more reason to go," Anna pressed. She glanced at Emily. The girl could learn something too. John Black's people have always been kind to outsiders who come with respect. Emily's heart quickened at the prospect. She'd seen Ute traders in town from afar, but had never spoken to them. Her father had always pulled her away, muttering harsh words under his breath. Jack remained silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Reckon we could make the journey, if Emily's willing." "I'd like to go," Emily said softly, surprising herself with how quickly the words came. They spent the remainder of the day preparing. Jack showed Emily how to pack their saddlebags with dried meat cornbread and small gifts of tobacco and coffee. He explained that guests never came empty-handed to such gatherings. The next morning, they set out before dawn. Emily rode the gentle mare Jack had been training her on while he led the way on his sturdy gelding. The trail wound through stands of aspen and pine, climbing higher before descending into hidden valleys. Emily's thighs ached from the long ride, but she didn't complain. As the sun began to set, they heard distant drum beats echoing through the trees. Jack led them down into a sheltered valley where dozens of lodges stood in a circle. Firelight danced between them, and the air was rich with the smell of cooking meat and wood smoke. Emily's nervousness returned as they dismounted. Several children ran past, laughing and pointing at the newcomers. Women in bright shawls moved between the fires, stirring large pots that hung over the flames. An elderly man with long silver braids approached them, his face creasing into a warm smile. "Brother," he said, embracing Jack. "Many moons have passed." "Too many," John Black Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. John Black turned to Emily, his dark eyes kind. "Welcome, young one. You are safe here." He gestured to a group of women working near one of the cooking fires. "Perhaps you would help with the evening meal. There are stories to be heard there." Emily looked to Jack, who nodded encouragingly. She made her way to the fire where a woman with laugh lines around her eyes handed her a wooden spoon and showed her how to stir the thick stew. Another woman began teaching her the names of the herbs they used, speaking slowly so Emily could understand. As the evening deepened, more people gathered around the fires. Children played games with painted stones, their shouts of laughter mixing with the steady drum beats. Elders told stories that made everyone chuckle, though Emily couldn't understand all words. Young men and women danced in circles, their feet moving in practiced patterns, while their beaded clothing caught the firelight. From her place by the cooking fire, Emily watched Jack sitting with John Black and other older men. Though he spoke little, his posture was relaxed, and occasionally he would nod or gesture as they talked. No one here looked at him with fear or suspicion. Instead, they treated him like a long-lost relative finally returned home. The woman beside her, who had introduced herself as Singing Bird, noticed Emily's attention. "Your father," she said in careful English, nodding toward Jack. "He was a good friend to our people before the great sadnessing." Emily wanted to ask what she meant, but something in the woman's tone suggested now wasn't the time. Instead, she focused on helping serve the stew in wooden bowls, accepting smiles and nods of thanks from each person who came to eat. As the moon rose over the valley, casting silver light through the trees, Emily felt a peace she hadn't known was possible. Here, among these people who welcomed strangers with such genuine warmth, she began to understand why Jack had chosen to live in the mountains. There was a truth here, simple and profound, that she had never found in town. Dawn broke over the valley in ribbons of pink and gold. Emily woke to the sound of women singing as they prepared breakfast, their voices carrying through the morning mist. The smell of coffee and wood smoke filled the air. After a breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with wild berries, John Black beckoned Jack and Emily to join him near his lodge. He sat cross-legged on a woven blanket, his weathered hands carefully preparing a long-stemmed pipe. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the blanket. "Share breath and story with an old man." Emily settled beside Jack, watching as John Black packed the pipe bowl with tobacco. The elder's movements were deliberate, almost like a prayer. He lit the pipe with a twig from the morning fire and drew deeply before passing it to Jack. "The smoke carries our words to the Creator," John Black explained to Emily. "It makes a path for truth to travel." He studied her face for a long moment. "I see something in you, young one, like embers waiting for wind." Jack took his turn with the pipe, then passed it back to John Black. The old man nodded thoughtfully. "Your spirit?" John Black continued. "It reminds me of the small fires we keep through winter, not blazing yet, but holding warmth waiting." He spoke a string of musical words in Ute, then translated, "Little fire, who waits. That is your name among us." Emily felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever given her a name that held such meaning, such promise. John Black turned to Jack. "Brother, the girl should know. The truth you carry is heavy, but sharing makes the load lighter." Jack's face grew tight with pain. He stared into the distance, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Had a wife," once he began. "Anna Walking Star. Met her when I was still preaching in Kansas Territory." He paused, drawing a shaky breath. "She was beautiful, smart, taught me more about God's love than any seminary ever did." Emily sat very still, hardly daring to breathe. Jack had never spoken so openly before. "We had a son," he continued. "Joseph. His mama's eyes, my stubborn chin." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "During the war, things got bad. Raids burning, folks taking sides, seeing enemies everywhere." John Black nodded gravely. "Dark times. Brother against brother. White against Indian. No one safe." Anna and Joseph were visiting a church in town one Sunday. Jack's voice cracked. "I was supposed to be there, but I'd stayed behind to help a sick neighbor. Raiders came through. Thought the church was harboring enemy sympathizers because they welcomed Indians." He closed his eyes. They barred the doors, set it ablaze. Emily's hand flew to her mouth. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks now. 23 souls lost that day," Jack whispered. "My family among them. I couldn't keep preaching after that. Words turned to ashes in my mouth. Came to these mountains to escape, maybe to die. But God wouldn't let me." John Black placed a gentle hand on Jack's shoulder. The Creator gives us grief to teach us compassion. You have learned well, brother. They sat in silence as the morning sun climbed higher. Around them, the camp continued its daily rhythms. Children playing women, working men tending horses. Life flowing on as it always did. That evening, after the fires had died down and most of the camp was sleeping, Emily knelt beside her bedroll. The stars seemed closer here in the valley, their light more intense. She folded her hands and, for the first time since leaving home, began to pray aloud. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling, "thank you for bringing me here, for showing me that love can grow in broken places." She thought of Jack's loss of his quiet kindness despite such pain. "Please help me be worthy of the name I was given today. Help me learn to shine without being afraid of my own light." Nearby, she heard Jack's shift in his sleep, muttering something that sounded like, "Amen." The journey back from the Ute gathering took longer than their ride out. Summer heat pressed down like a heavy blanket, making both horses and riders move slower through the mountain paths. Emily's mind wandered back to the stories shared around the fire, to John Black's wisdom, and to Jack's painful truth. By late afternoon, the familiar sight of the cabin emerged through the trees, but something was different. Jack noticed it first, pulling his horse to a sudden stop. There, nailed to the porch post, a piece of paper fluttered in the warm breeze. "Stay here," he said, quietly, dismounting to investigate. Emily watched as he approached the porch, his shoulders tense. When he pulled the paper free and read it, his jaw tightened. Without a word, he handed the telegram to her. The message was brief but clear. "William Turner arriving next week, demands return of daughter. James Wells." Emily's hands trembled as she read the words. The peace she'd found in these mountains suddenly felt fragile as morning frost. "I won't go back," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I won't." Jack nodded slowly. "You won't." That evening, after the horses were tended and supper eaten, Jack sat on the porch. The steady rhythm of stone against steel filled the twilight as he sharpened his axe. Emily watched through the window as she washed dishes, understanding the message in every stroke. Preparation, protection, promise. They rose early the next morning, tackling chores with quiet determination. Emily swept the cabin floor and arranged fresh wildflowers in a tin can. Jack checked the wagon wheels and cleaned his rifle. They were ready when they heard the jingling of Anna Thompson's mule bells approaching. The midwife appeared around the bend, her sturdy mule loaded with supplies. But it wasn't just medicines and dried goods she brought. Tucked into her apron pocket was the latest edition of the Whetstone Weekly. "Thought you might want to see this," Anna said, pulling out the paper and handing it to Jack. Page 3, bottom right. There, in small but clear print, was a column titled, "The Mountain Preacher and the Girl He Redeemed." Jack read aloud, his voice growing softer with each word. The article spoke of a man who had lost everything but found purpose in saving others. It told of a girl cast aside who discovered her worth in the shadow of the mountains. It painted a picture of healing, of quiet dignity, of God's hand moving in mysterious ways. When he finished reading, Jack looked at Emily with questioning eyes. She twisted her apron in her hands. "I wrote it," she admitted, under the name Mary Grace. I sent it last time Anna visited. People needed to know the truth before Pa comes." Anna nodded approvingly. "And a fine piece of writing it is, too. Already heard folks in town talking about it. Changes the story somewhat, doesn't it?" Jack carefully folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "So long as it's true," he said simply. "Every word," Emily assured him. "Every single word." They spent the rest of the morning unloading Anna's supplies: dried beans, coffee sugar, ammunition, and medical supplies. The midwife had brought extra, knowing troubled times might lie ahead. "Your pa won't come alone," Anna warned as she prepared to leave. "He's been gathering supporters, telling tales about stolen daughters and mountain men." "Let him come," Jack said quietly. "Truth stands its ground." Emily watched Anna disappear down the trail, then turned to the cabin. Her home now, she realized. The afternoon sun caught the fresh swept porch boards, the tidy woodpile, the garden with its neat rows. Everything here spoke of care, of respect, of belonging. She pulled out her drawing paper and charcoal, settling on the porch steps. While Jack worked in the barn, she sketched the scene before her. The cabin nestled against the mountainside, smoke curling from the chimney. Wildflowers nodding in the summer breeze. At the bottom, she wrote in careful letters, "Home is where healing begins." The sound of Jack's axe rang out from behind the cabin, steady, strong, and sure. The morning sun barely touched the mountain peaks when dust clouds rose on the trail. Emily spotted them first from the garden, where she'd been gathering late summer beans. Her hands froze mid-task, the basket dropping to her feet. "They're coming!" she called out, her voice trembling. Jack emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his worn leather vest. Anna Thompson, who'd stayed to help prepare for this moment, stepped onto the porch with her medicine bag close. 2 riders appeared, first followed by a wagon. Emily's heart clenched as she recognized her father's straight-backed posture and the glint of a sheriff's badge in the morning light. The horses thundered into the yard, spraying dirt and pebbles. William Turner jumped down before his horse fully stopped. Behind him, James Mills from the valley town dismounted more slowly, his badge crooked on his vest and his eyes sharp with something that wasn't justice. "There's my wayward girl." William spat, stalking toward Emily, living in sin with a mountain hermit. Jack stepped between them, his voice low and steady. "The girl's safe here, no sin, no harm." James Mills pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Got here paper saying different, says you took her against the law, says you've been keeping her improper like." "That's a lie." Emily moved forward, her face flushed with anger. "He saved me when you sold me, Pa. Like I was nothing but cattle." The crack of William's hand across her face echoed against the cabin walls. Emily stumbled backward, holding her cheek. Anna Thompson rushed to her side while Jack's hands clenched into fists. "Don't you dare touch her again!" Jack growled, every muscle in his body straining to hold back. The James unfolded his papers with a smirk. "These documents say the girl's underage, says her pa never properly agreed to any transfer of custody. That makes you a kidnapper, Davis." "Those papers are false as a snake's promises." Anna declared, her arm protective around Emily's shoulders. "Half the town witnessed William Turner's public sale of his own flesh and blood. I'll testify to it in any court. A midwife's word against legal papers." The James laughed. "Don't think that'll stand up, ma'am." Movement in the trees drew their attention. John Black emerged from the forest path, his presence commanding silence. He walked steadily into the yard, stopping beside Jack. "These mountains," John Black said, his English clear and deliberate, "fall under treaty lands. Your valley laws have no power here." James Mills' face reddened. "Now see here, Indian." "I see very well," John Black interrupted. "I see a father who throws away his child. I see a lawman who twists truth for coin, and I see a good man who offers shelter to the wounded." William stepped forward, his hand hovering near his gun. "This ain't your business." "All injustice is my business," John Black replied. "These slopes have witnessed too many broken promises." The James's patience snapped. He drew his pistol, pointing it first at John Black, then at Jack. "That's enough talk. Davis, you're under arrest for kidnapping and moral indecency. The girl goes home with her No." Emily tried to run to Jack, but William grabbed her arm roughly. The James approached with handcuffs, while Jack stood silent, his eyes fixed on Emily. He offered no resistance as the cold metal closed around his wrists. "Get in the wagon, girl," William ordered, shoving Emily toward his waiting rig. "This isn't right," Anna protested. But the James's deputy had arrived, training his rifle on anyone who might interfere. Emily's tears fell freely as she was forced into the wagon's hard seat. She watched helplessly as the James led Jack to his own horse, binding the reins to his saddle horn. "The truth will come out," Jack called to her, his voice strong despite his bonds. "Stay strong, child." John Black raised his hand in farewell. "We will not forget," he promised, while Anna nodded firmly beside him. The wagon lurched forward, beginning the long descent toward Whetstone. Emily twisted around, watching through her tears, as the cabin grew smaller, the place where she'd finally found peace, now fading into the mountain mist. Ahead lay the town jail, where Jack would be locked away, and her father's ranch, where old wounds waited to reopen. The last thing she saw before the trail bent away was Anna Thompson and John Black, standing like sentinels in the yard, their faces set with determination. Whatever came next, she knew she wasn't alone in this fight. The bunkhouse hadn't changed, same rough planks, same musty straw mattress, same small window, with iron bars that William had installed years ago to keep her from midnight wandering. Emily huddled on the thin blanket as darkness settled over the ranch. The lock clicked heavily in the door. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by the howling of distant coyotes and the weight of dread in her stomach. When dawn finally painted the eastern sky, Emily heard boots on the porch and keys rattling. "Make yourself presentable," William ordered, throwing a freshly pressed dress through the doorway. "Church starts in an hour." The dress was stiff and too tight, clearly bought for a smaller girl. Emily struggled with the buttons, her fingers trembling. Through the window, she watched ranch hands pause their morning chores to stare. Their whispers carried across the yard. The wagon ride to town was silent. William sat straight-backed, his Sunday suit immaculate, while Emily perched uncomfortably beside him. As they approached the white-painted church, she saw widow Elizabeth Harris standing near the steps in her finest silk dress. The wealthy woman's eyes narrowed at their approach. "Why William Turner?" Elizabeth called out, her voice honey-sweet. "How blessed we are that you've brought your dear child back to the fold." William helped Elizabeth up into the wagon with excessive gentility. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Elizabeth. Sometimes our trials lead us home." Emily's cheeks burned as they entered the church together, William positioning them prominently in the third pew. Whispers rustled like autumn leaves through the congregation. She caught fragments "Mountain Man Scandal" by poor William Turner. The preacher's sermon seemed aimed directly at her, full of references to prodigal children and the dangers of straying. Emily kept her eyes fixed on her lap, where her hands twisted the rough fabric of her dress. Tears threatened, but she refused to let them fall. Just as the service reached its final hymn, the church door creaked open. Anna Thompson stepped in, her spine straight as a lodgepole pine. Behind her came Running Elk, causing a ripple of shocked murmurs, but it was the group that followed that made Emily's heart leap. Mark Williams from the general store, Anna Roberts, who ran the boarding house, and 3 other townsfolk who'd witnessed her sale that spring morning. They filed into the back pew, their presence like a sudden wind changing the air in the church. Mark Williams's voice carried clearly during a pause in the singing. "Ain't right, selling your own flesh and blood, then claiming theft." More whispers spread, different now. "I remember that day. Called her unfit, he did. Traded her for flour and a rifle." William's face darkened. He gripped Emily's arm as they exited after the service, steering her quickly toward the wagon. But Grace Prescott held back her expression troubled as she watched Anna Thompson approach. Elizabeth Anna said quietly, "Might we have a word about young Emily?" The widow's eyes darted between William and Anna. Perhaps we should discuss this matter properly." "There's nothing to discuss," William snapped, but Elizabeth's spine stiffened at his tone. "I believe there is, Mr. Boone," she said coolly, "especially if what I'm hearing about a public sale is true." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the ranch yard, Emily heard soft footsteps outside the bunkhouse. A key turned in the lock, not her father's key. Anna Thompson's familiar face appeared in the doorway. "Quick now, child," she whispered. "We're getting you somewhere safe until the hearing." They slipped through the darkness to where Grace Edwards, the quiet sister of the church pianist, waited with her wagon hidden behind the barn. The older woman helped Emily up, without a word, covering her with a quilt. 2 days, Anna murmured as they pulled away from the ranch. "The circuit judge will hear everything then. John Black's gone to fetch Jack from the jail in Whetstone. Your father may have friends in the valley, but we have truth on our side." Grace Edwards' house sat on the edge of town, its windows warm with lamplight. Inside, the woman finally spoke, her voice gentle. "Your room's ready upstairs, dear. No locked doors here." Emily climbed the stairs to find a real bed, with a clean quilt, a washing basin with fresh water, and a small desk by the window. On the desk lay her drawing papers and charcoal sticks from the cabin, somehow rescued and brought here. She touched the familiar materials with trembling fingers, remembering the peace of the mountain morning when Jack had first encouraged her art. 2 days until the hearing. 2 days to find the courage to stand up and speak her truth, not just sketch it in silent shadows. The town hall's wooden benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like half of Whetstone. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light that streamed through the high windows. Emily sat straight-backed between Anna Thompson and Grace Edwards, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man with silver at his temples, called the hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. The sound echoed through the packed room like gunshots. "This court will hear testimony regarding the custody dispute between William Turner and Jack Davis concerning 1. Emily Carter," the judge announced, his voice carrying to the rafters. "James Walker, present your evidence." The Valley Sheriff swaggered forward, producing a leather folder. "Your Honor, I have here documents proving Mr. Boone never legally surrendered custody of his minor daughter." He spread several papers across the judge's desk with flourish. "These show his continued guardianship and right to reclaim her." Emily's heart sank as she watched the judge examine the papers, but Anna Thompson squeezed her hand and stood, her skirts rustling as she approached the bench. "Your Honor, I present the town newspaper from just last week." Anna's voice rang clear and strong as she handed over the folded paper. An article written by Emily herself, under a pen name, describing the public sale that took place on the steps of Wheeler's General Store this past spring. Mark Williams stood up from his place near the back. "I witnessed that sale myself, Your Honor. William Turner traded his daughter for a Winchester rifle and 3 sacks of flour. Called her unfit for ranch life, he did. Made quite a spectacle of it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Anna Roberts and 2 other townspeople nodded vigorously, adding their voices to confirm Wheeler's account. William's face darkened. That was no legal sale, just a lesson meant to frighten some sense into an ungrateful child. A lesson Grace Edwards' quiet voice cut through his bluster. She rose slowly, her black silk dress rustling. "Mr. Boone, I've watched you parade your daughter's shame through our church, seen you lock her away like an animal. What lesson does that teach, except cruelty?" The widow's words landed like stones in still water. Several women in the crowd nodded, and even the judge's expression shifted. Before William could respond, John Black stepped forward. The Ute elder moved with quiet dignity, carrying a leather tube that drew all eyes. "I present treaty documents," he said, his English clear and measured, "signed by territorial governor and tribal council." He carefully unrolled the papers. "This land where Jack Davis lives, it is protected territory. William Turner's cattle grazing rights were never valid there. He has no legal authority over that mountain or anyone who dwells there." The judge adjusted his spectacles, studying the treaty maps and signatures with growing interest. James Walker shifted uncomfortably, his forged documents suddenly looking flimsy in comparison. Furthermore, John Black continued, "Jack Davis is known to our people as a man of honor. He was married to my sister's daughter before war took them. He has right to live on that land and right to offer shelter to those in need." Emily hadn't known about John Black's family connection to Jack's wife. Her heart ached as she watched the stoic mountain man bow his head at the elder's words. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Boone, these treaty documents appear to invalidate any claim you might make regarding Mr. Davis's homestead or his right to offer sanctuary there." He peered over his glasses. "And these multiple witnesses to a public sale, regardless of your intended lesson, raise serious concerns about your fitness as a guardian." William surged to his feet. "You can't believe these." "I can and do believe them." The judge cut him off sharply, especially given the testimony of respected members of this community. He nodded toward Grace Edwards and Anna Thompson. "The evidence of your public abuse of your daughter is compelling." The room held its breath as Judge Harrison shuffled the papers before him. Emily felt the weight of all eyes upon her, but for the first time those stares held sympathy instead of judgment. "This court finds that William Turner surrendered his parental rights through public sale and subsequent abandonment," the judge declared. "Furthermore, his grazing claims being invalid, he has no standing to challenge Mr. Davis's custody arrangements." He looked directly at Emily. "Young lady, you are free to choose your own path forward." The gavel fell with finality. William stormed from the hall, leaving only the echo of his boots and the whispers of the crowd. Emily sat very still, tears rolling silently down her cheeks as Anna Thompson wrapped her in a fierce embrace. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Whetstone's main street as Judge Harrison delivered his final ruling from the courthouse steps. A crowd had gathered, their faces solemn as they watched William Turner receive his sentence. For public endangerment and false testimony, the judge declared, his voice carrying across the dusty street, "You are hereby fined $500 and ordered to leave Whetstone by sundown tomorrow." He turned to James Walker, who stood with his badge already unpinned. "And you, sir, are suspended from duty pending a full investigation into abuse of power and falsification of documents." The sheriff's face reddened as he backed away from the courthouse. Whispers rippled through the crowd as both men slunk away in different directions, leaving only the sound of boot heels on wooden planks. Inside the jail, Jack sat quietly on his cot as Anna Thompson arrived with the keys. "Time to go home," she said softly, unlocking his cell. The mountain man stood slowly, straightening his worn jacket with dignity. "Much obliged," he said simply, but his eyes held deeper gratitude. The late afternoon light painted the church white walls golden as Jack made his way down the street. His steps were measured, unhurried, though his heart quickened when he saw Emily waiting on the church steps. She stood with Anna Thompson, who had hurried ahead to join her, both women's faces bright with relief. Jack stopped at the bottom step and held out his weathered hand, offering Emily the choice to take it or not. But she didn't hesitate. Instead of accepting his hand, she flew down the steps and wrapped her arms around his middle, pressing her face against his chest. "You're the only father I want," she whispered. her voice muffled against his jacket. Jack stood frozen for a moment, then slowly brought his arms up to embrace her. His throat worked silently as he rested his chin on her head. Anna Thompson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, smiling through happy tears. The ride back to the mountain cabin was quiet but peaceful. The summer evening wrapped around them like a warm blanket as their horses picked their way up the familiar trail. When they reached the clearing, the cabin stood waiting just as they'd left it. While Jack tended to the horses, Emily went to check on the injured hawk they'd been nursing. Her steps slowed as she approached the makeshift nest they'd built on the porch. The bird lay still, its proud head tucked against its wing, as if in sleep, but she knew immediately it had passed. "Jack," she called softly. He came to stand beside her, looking down at the hawk's still form. Together they carried it to a quiet spot near the garden, where wildflowers nodded in the evening breeze. Jack dug a small grave, while Emily gathered blooms to lay over it. The sun was setting as they stood beside the fresh-turned earth. "You set it free," Jack said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Emily looked up at him, understanding in her eyes. "It set me free too," she replied. She reached for his hand, and this time he took it without hesitation. They stood there as the first stars appeared, a father and daughter bound not by blood, but by choice, their shadows merging in the gathering dusk. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and late summer flowers, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill began its evening song. Anna Thompson had told Emily once that healing comes in its own time, like spring after winter. Standing there beside Jack, she felt the truth of those words deep in her bones. The hawk had never fully healed its wing, but in its final days it had known gentleness and care. Sometimes she realized that was the greatest freedom of all. The cabin windows glowed warm and welcoming as darkness settled over the mountain. Inside, the familiar scents of wood smoke and dried herbs wrapped around them like an embrace. Jack built up the fire while Emily set about making tea, their movements in harmony after months of shared life. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance. The locked trunk still sat in the loft above, but its mysteries no longer felt like barriers between them. Whatever sorrows it held belonged to the past. Here and now, they had built something new, a family forged in understanding, strengthened by mercy, and blessed by grace. Late August brought cooler mornings to the mountain. Emily sat on the cabin's front porch, arranging wooden benches in a half circle, while the sun climbed over the eastern ridge. She smoothed her clean apron and checked her slateboard one more time, heart fluttering with nervous excitement. "They'll be here soon," Jack said quietly, pausing in his work on the new chicken coop. He'd been expanding it all week, the sound of his hammer marking time like a heartbeat across the yard. The first to arrive was Mark-Me Fletcher, age 8, pulling his little sister Anna by the hand up the winding path. Their mother followed, carrying a basket of fresh-baked bread. More families trickled in, the Hendersons with their 3 children, the Williams twins, and 2 Ute families Emily recognized from the summer gathering. "Welcome, Emily," called out, her voice stronger than she expected. "Please find a seat." Anna Thompson appeared just then, her mule laden with books and supplies. She began unpacking primers, chalk, and paper while the children settled onto the benches. Their eyes were bright with curiosity, fixed on Emily as she wrote her name carefully on the slate. "I reckon we'll start with letters," Emily said, smiling at the youngest ones. "Both English and Ute, if you please." John Black arrived as she was teaching the alphabet, carrying a leather-bound book decorated with careful beadwork. He waited until the children finished their first lesson before approaching. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, presenting the book to Emily. "Stories of our people, written in both tongues. The children should know both ways." Emily accepted the gift with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, running her fingers over the beaded cover. "I'll treat it with great care." The morning passed in a blur of lessons. Emily discovered that teaching came naturally to her. She had patience for the slower learners and gentle encouragement for the shy ones. When little Anna struggled with her letters, Emily showed her how to draw them in the dirt first, making it feel like play instead of work. From his spot by the chicken coop, Jack watched. His hands stayed busy with hammer and nails, but his eyes often drifted to the porch where Emily's voice rose and fell like music. He'd cleared a wider space in the yard, making room for the new herb garden he was planning. The scent of fresh-turned earth mingled with the sweet mountain air. Near noon, while the children ate their lunch under the old pine tree, Anna Thompson handed Emily an envelope. "From Denver," she said with a knowing smile. "The newspaper editor was mighty impressed with your first piece." Emily's hands shook as she opened the letter. Her eyes grew wide as she read, "Dear Miss Boone, your article, Mountain Mercy, touched many hearts. We would welcome more stories from your unique perspective. Please consider becoming a regular contributor." She pressed the letter to her chest, looking out over the schoolyard her porch had become. Anna was sharing her biscuit with Standing Cloud, a Ute girl her age. Mark Me Fletcher was teaching John Black's son how to whistle through a grass blade. The barriers between their worlds seemed to dissolve in the simple joy of childhood friendship. That evening, after the families had gone home, Emily sat at the table with her charcoal and paper. Her sketches flowed freely now, no longer hidden, no longer haunted. She drew the children's faces, captured the way the sunlight played on Standing Cloud's hair, sketched Mark Me's gap-toothed grin. Jack came in from finishing the chicken coop, washing up at the basin. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and fresh bread of herbs drying in the rafters, and the wildflower bouquet Anna had picked for her teacher. "Reckon you found your calling," he said softly, looking over her shoulder at the drawings. Emily nodded, adding one last detail to Standing Cloud's smile. "The children don't see differences," she said. "They just see friends." "That's because they ain't learned hate yet," Jack replied. "Maybe your teaching will help keep it that way." Laughter drifted up from her memory of the day, the sound of children playing, learning, growing together. It echoed in the cabin's warm spaces, filling the corners where shadows used to lurk. She looked at her father, for that's truly what he was now, and saw peace in his eyes that matched her own. The next morning's lesson would bring new stories, new words, new connections between two worlds. But for now, Emily simply sat in the quiet evening, drawing the future she could already see, unfolding one child's smile at a time. The first snow of winter drifted down in lazy spirals outside the cabin windows. Emily sat in her favorite chair, the one Jack had crafted for her from aspen wood, with a leather-bound journal open in her lap. The lamplight cast a warm glow across the pages as she read aloud, her voice steady and clear in the peaceful evening air. The mountain teaches patience when she read from her latest story. It shows us how to wait through storms, how to bend without breaking, how to grow strong in rocky soil. Like the aspens that share their roots underground, we learn that no soul stands truly alone. Jack sat in his own chair near the crackling fire, his weathered hands folded in his lap. The flames painted shadows across his face, but his eyes were soft as he listened. He'd removed his boots earlier, and his sock-clad feet stretched toward the hearth's warmth. A half-finished wooden toy horse rested on the table beside him, a Christmas gift in progress for little Anna Fletcher. Emily turned another page, continuing to share the words she'd crafted over the past months. Her writing had grown stronger, just as she had. The Denver newspaper now published her stories, regularly tales of mountain life and healing that reached far beyond their quiet valley. "We measure time differently here," she read. not by town clocks or church bells, but by the rhythm of seasons, the arc of the sun, the evening song of thrushes. Time enough for wounds to mend for trust, to grow for love, to find its own path home. The snow fell thicker now, dusting the window ledges with white. In the corner, dried herbs hung in neat bundles, some for healing, some for cooking, all gathered and preserved by 4 careful hands working together. The cabin smelled of pine-warm bread and the coffee Jack had brewed after supper. When Emily finished the last page, she looked up to find Jack watching her with quiet pride. "It's good," he said, simply nodding toward the journal. "It's honest." Those words coming from him meant everything. Honesty had built this home between them brick by brick, truth by truth, until shelter became sanctuary. Emily closed the journal and turned to watch the snow through the window. The white flakes danced in the darkness, each one catching the lamplight for a brief, shining moment. "We made it," she whispered, more to herself than to Jack, but he heard as he always did. Outside, through the glass, she could see the empty wooden perch where they attended the wounded hawk through summer. It swayed gently in the winter wind, a reminder of another soul that had found healing here. The hawk had taught her about patience, about the courage to trust, about knowing when to hold on and when to let go. The fire popped and settled, sending up a shower of sparks. Emily reached for her newer journal, the one she wrote in each night before bed. The pages held her private thoughts, her prayers, her moments of doubt and triumph. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write, the words flowing easily now. She wrote about the children who came to learn about Anna Thompson's weekly visits, about John Black's stories and wisdom. She wrote about Jack teaching her to split wood, to read weather in the clouds, to find peace in silence. She wrote about the way he'd given her space to grow, to choose to become herself. Finally, she wrote the truth that had taken root in her heart, like an aspen sending up new shoots. "He didn't buy me. He brought me home." Jack stood slowly, his joints creaking like the old floorboards. He added another log to the fire, then paused behind Emily's chair. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a gesture that would have terrified her months ago, but now felt as natural as breathing. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow erase the day's footprints from the yard. The hearth glowed warm with hope, and 2 once-broken hearts beat steady and strong side by side, whole again. Not despite their scars, but because of them. Each crack had been filled with gold trust truth, and the kind of love that chooses day by day to stay. Outside, winter settled its quiet blanket over the mountain. Inside, father and daughter shared the peace they had built together, word by word, day by day, until home meant more than walls and roof. It meant belonging at last to each other. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.